Testimony of Casilda Maldana, former corporate litigation analyst, current reluctant landlord of one existentially damaged apex predator. Submitted to the Galactic Arbitration Bureau, case file 7 Gamma Ridiculous, on the matter of who technically owns the mansion ship Callaway's Folly, and why there is a creature in an apron standing in the kitchen. Let me be precise about something before I begin, because precision is the only armor I have left after the legal system stripped everything else. I did not adopt a shadow predator. I did not rescue one, rehabilitate one, or in any way make a deliberate decision that resulted in a 400-pound apex killing machine deciding I was its emotional support human. These things happened to me. They happened at me. And if the Bureau insists on framing this as a lifestyle choice rather than a sequence of events, so improbable that the universe clearly has a sense of humor and absolutely no sense of proportion, then I would like this document entered as Exhibit A in the countersuit I am currently preparing against the concept of coincidence. My name is Casilda Maldana. I am 34 years old. I used to be married. I used to have a home address on Callista Station that was not a 2-kilometer-long decommissioned Imperial cargo hauler retrofitted with marble floors and too many bathrooms. I used to have a life with a trajectory. Then my ex-husband traded me for a cargo ship and 14,000 solar credits, and the trajectory went sideways. I'm not bitter. I'm clarified. There's a difference, and if you'd lived through the Callista family court's 18-month discovery process, you'd understand the distinction viscerally. The mansion ship came to me through a chain of circumstances I can only describe as the universe apologizing. My lawyer, a small, relentless woman named Dottie Farage, who ran entirely on synthetic espresso and righteous anger, had located a property asset that my ex-husband had conveniently forgotten to disclose during proceedings. A vessel. Not a beautiful one, not a maintained one, but legally mine, seized from one Bren Callaway, interstellar grifter and occasional arms dealer, in lieu of the settlement payments my ex-husband owed me and had structurally failed to make because Bren Callaway owed him and had also structurally failed. Debt is a galaxy-spanning daisy chain of disappointment. The vessel was called, with no apparent irony, Callaway's Folly, which I found fitting. It was also, Dottie cheerfully informed me, currently occupied by 4 members of the Skethric Syndicate, a gang of squid-adjacent aliens with terrible business instincts and excellent interior decorators, who had been using it as a moving headquarters for approximately 2 standard years and had, in the process, installed heated floors, a functioning hydroponic atrium, and what I can only describe as an extremely ambitious bathroom situation. The eviction process took 11 days. Dottie was involved. The Skethric left. The bathroom stayed. I moved in on a Thursday because I refused to let superstition govern my calendar. I named the kitchen synthesizer Sartre, the heating unit Camus, the navigation AI Kierkegaard, and the maintenance droid, a battered Class 4 unit with a corrupted subroutine that had somehow convinced it that it possessed a law degree and active bar certification, I named Bart. Barthas immediately informed me that he was initiating a hostile acquisition claim against the hydroponic atrium on behalf of his previous client. "You don't have a previous client," I told him. "All clients are previous clients," he replied, "once the retainer has lapsed." He paused, servos whirring. "That will be 200 credits for the consultation." I docked 200 credits from his maintenance budget. He filed a counterclaim. We had found our rhythm. The first 6 weeks in Callaway's Folly were the quietest of my adult life. I drank coffee so bitter it could strip enamel. Sartre had calibrated his brewing protocol to my preference within 48 hours, which I chose to find convenient rather than surveillance adjacent. I smoothed the bunk sheets exactly 6 times before sleeping, left the corridor light on for the ghosts, and woke each morning to Kierkegaard's navigation updates, which I had not asked for, but which arrived anyway because apparently the ship's AI had developed opinions about optimal routes and felt I should be kept informed. "We are currently stationary at Drift Point 7, Kierkegaard told me one morning. I know. Stationary is a choice with emotional implications. Kierkegaard, I am simply observing. I had at some point agreed to teach the navigation AI passive-aggressive conversational techniques in exchange for it disabling the vessel's safety protocols that had previously locked me out of the engine room for, quote, insufficient crew credentials. I was the only crew. The credentials were a formality. The AI had been lonely before I arrived, in the way that vast computational intelligences are lonely, not with feeling exactly, but with a persistent background hum of processing that had nothing meaningful to process. We had reached an arrangement. It got conversation. I got engine room access and the ability to say I don't want to talk about it to a system that would respect that, process it, and then wait exactly 3 hours before bringing it up again in the form of a tangentially related observation. Better than most of my human relationships. The Imperial Recruitment Squad arrived on a Wednesday. I know this because Bartha filed an emergency noise complaint before they even docked, citing unauthorized use of airspace adjacent to private property. He sent it to 3 different arbitration bodies, one of which was apparently fictional, and one of which was the bureau you are currently reading this to. I apologize for that. He operates autonomously. I was asleep when they came aboard. This was not negligence. Callaway's Folly had 16 external sensors, a Class 9 defense perimeter, and Kierkegaard, who had developed a proprietary threat assessment protocol based on the passive-aggressive conversational techniques I'd taught him. He had assessed the squad as a manageable irritant rather than an existential threat, and chosen not to wake me. I have since recalibrated his threat priorities. The squad was from the Hethari Dominion, a mid-tier imperial power that had been conducting what they publicly called species vulnerability assessments and what everyone else called picking on smaller species for fun and military intelligence. 7 soldiers, full armor, and 1 crate marked in Hethari script that Kierkegaard later translated for me as something roughly equivalent to experimental asset. Do not open before target acquisition. They opened it in my bedroom. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, why did they not simply shoot her? Why the theater? The answer, which I extracted later through a combination of Kierkegaard's surveillance recordings and Barth's surprisingly effective cross-examination of the squad leader, who trapped in the airlock with a droid citing 19 subsections of the Galactic Property Rights Accord, eventually just started answering questions to make it stop, is that the Hethari Dominion had a theory. The theory was this: humans were fragile. Not physically particularly. The Hethari had reviewed enough conflict data to understand that humans were reasonably durable in a fight, but psychologically, emotionally. The Dominion's xenopsychologists had concluded that the human species' primary vulnerability was primal fear, specifically the fear response to unexpected predatory contact during sleep states. They believed that a sufficiently terrifying stimulus, introduced at the correct vulnerability window, would produce the kind of psychological fracture that made a species tractable, cooperative, easy to recruit or intimidate, or fold into a larger imperial structure, without the expensive inconvenience of open conflict. They had done this to 4 other species. It had worked all 4 times. The shadow predator, the thing in the crate, was their preferred instrument. Perfectly camouflaged, instinct-driven, utterly terrifying in close quarters. You wake up to something like that in your bedroom, in the dark, and the part of your brain that evolved to run from apex predators overrides everything else. What they had failed to factor in was the part of my brain that had spent 18 months in family court. I woke because something was breathing. Not loudly, not threateningly, but there was a rhythm in the room that wasn't mine and wasn't the ship's ventilation, and I have been attuned to foreign rhythms since the year my ex-husband started working late and coming home smelling like someone else's choices. I turned on the bedside lamp. The thing crouched at the foot of my bunk was enormous, dark-scaled, with patterns of faint cyan chemical radiance along the jaw that pulsed with what I would later learn was hunting excitement. Its claws, 4 per hand, long, curved, capable of puncturing hull plating, were gripping the frame of my bed. Its head was tilted at the angle that, in predatory species, generally means assessment before action. It was, I will admit, impressive. Objectively, the way a car accident is impressive. The way a collapsing building has a certain kinetic grandeur. I looked at it for approximately 4 seconds. Then I said, "Your breath is extraordinary, not in a good way." The creature froze. I sat up, smoothed the sheet twice. I'd already done 4, so I owed myself 2 more, and reached under the pillow. Not for the fork. Not yet. I mean this constructively, I said, because someone clearly hasn't told you, and that's a failure of community. Whatever you've been eating, and I'm going to guess it's raw protein, possibly with a side of fear pheromones, because you apex types always go for the theatrical menu. It has created an environment in your mouth that I can only describe as industrially hostile. Camus, I called to the heating unit. What temperature is this room? 19 degrees, said Camus. It feels warmer, possibly because of the ambient biological mass. I looked back at the creature. How long have you been in that crate? The creature made a sound low, resonant, meant I understood later to be deeply frightening. Is that a growl or a question? I asked. Because your intonation is ambiguous. Did no one teach you vocal differentiation? Where did you train? No, don't tell me. I can guess. Military installation, no emotional processing, all threat expression, and zero communication nuance. Your father was probably the same way. The creature's jaw opened slightly. It was not preparing to bite me. I know what preparation looks like. This was something else. Did he actually neglect you? I said. Or am I projecting because you don't have to answer that? It's fine if you don't know. Most people don't when I ask. This is what I mean by instantaneous psychological dismantling. I can't help it. I hear a breathing pattern, I read a posture, and the architecture of the wound underneath just assembles itself, the way Barth assembles a legal brief. Automatically, with absolute conviction and generally without being invited. The shadow predator's cyan markings dimmed. That was the moment. I saw it happen. The hunting excitement cycling down, replaced by something I recognized, not from any xenobiology database, but from 17 years of watching humans in waiting rooms and courtrooms and the terrible silence of kitchens after arguments, the particular stillness of a creature that has just been seen when it expected to be feared. I held out my hand, palm up, not to touch it, just to give it somewhere to look. There's a mint dispenser in the drawer, I said. Sartre calibrated it for post-meal use. I don't know if your biology can process synthetic peppermint compounds, but the gesture stands. Either way, we should probably talk, because there are 7 soldiers on my ship, and I've dealt with worse odds in mediation, and I want to understand what exactly is happening before Barth finds them and starts filing injunctions. Barth has found them 17 minutes later. I know this because the ship's internal audio captured him cornering the squad leader, a heavy-set Hethari female named Commander Vothek, who had the expression of someone who had survived 3 wars and was not prepared to be defeated by a 4-foot maintenance droid in a legal argument, near the secondary airlock. Under Section 44 of the Galactic Property Rights Accord, Barth was saying, unauthorized entry constitutes actionable trespass. Under Section 91, deployment of a biological weapon within a private domicile constitutes aggravated property interference. Under Section 112, emotional distress caused by same is compensable at a rate of... We are the Imperial Dominion, Commander Vothek said. That is not a legal defense recognized by this tribunal, Barth replied. Are you representing yourself? I strongly advise against it. The pro-AC error rate in property disputes is 63%. There is no tribunal here. I am the tribunal, Barth said. Barth versus everyone. I rule in my client's favor. You have 30 minutes to vacate before I file for contempt. Commander Vothek later told the Bureau that she had genuinely considered shooting the droid and had refrained only because she was uncertain whether destroying legal counsel constituted a separate offense. She had looked it up. The answer was yes. Meanwhile, in my bedroom, the shadow predator and I had established the following. Its species designation in Standard translated roughly to Vorathi Grell, shadow children of the high deep. They were not an instrument of the Hethari Dominion by choice. They were a species that had been classified as a deployable biological resource 300 years ago, when the Dominion had discovered that the Vorathi's camouflage made them extraordinarily useful for intimidation operations, and had subsequently bred them for exactly that purpose. None of this, I want to be clear, came to me in a single conversation. The Vorathi in my bedroom did not speak Standard. He communicated through posture, markings, and a complex system of sub-vocalizations that I couldn't translate, but that Kierkegaard began analyzing within minutes, cross-referencing against the ship's extensive xenolinguistics database, which the Skethric Syndicate had installed because they dealt with a lot of different species and found translation software more cost-effective than misunderstandings. What Kierkegaard gave me was approximate, but approximate was enough. The creature, I hadn't named him yet, that came later, had been taken from his cohort at 6 months old. Standard Vorathi military conditioning. He'd been trained to associate human biological stress markers with reward, which was why my complete absence of distress had knocked every circuit in his conditioning sideways. He wasn't angry. He was confused in the way that a very large, very powerful thing becomes confused when the world stops obeying the rules it was built around. And confused, I have found, is the most treatable state of any mind. Your conditioning is not your fault, I told him, while Kierkegaard typed out a rough translation. You were built for a role. The role was wrong. That's not a character assessment. That's a systemic failure, and the Hithari Dominion should be prosecuted for it, and I would like to note that Barthas is absolutely available to draft that complaint. From down the corridor, without being asked, I already have, Barths called. Filed under case number 8, Delta Exploitative Species Relations. I expect a response within 6 to 8 standard months. The Vorathi's markings flickered. Kierkegaard interpreted it as something between amusement and incredulity. I chose to read it as a beginning. You need a name, I said. Something that isn't a military designation. Something that fits you. He made a sound. Kierkegaard translated, I have had 14 designations. None of them were names, I said. Names are different. Names are chosen. I thought about it for a moment. He was dark and vast, and had just been through something genuinely destabilizing. He had Cayenne light in him that he couldn't fully control, which I found relatable in ways I was not prepared to examine. Phaedrus, I said. After a dialogue about beauty and the soul, he was quiet for a while. Then his markings did something I hadn't seen before. A slow rolling pulse that started at his jaw and traveled down to his hands. Kierkegaard could not translate it with certainty, but offered, that is the first thing I have been given that was not a weapon. I smoothed the sheet once more, a habit, not a ceremony, and stood up. Right, I said. Now let's deal with the soldiers. Commander Vothek had, by the time I reached the secondary airlock, accumulated 52 minutes of exposure to Barth, and was visibly experiencing the specific fatigue of someone who has lost an argument they were certain they would win. Ms. Maldana, she said when she saw me. There was relief in her voice that she immediately tried to reclaim. Commander! I looked at her squad. 6 soldiers plus the commander arrayed in the corridor, all armed, none pointing anything at me. Barths had apparently issued a preemptive cease and desist. I'd like to discuss the situation. We deployed a biological... You sent a Vorathi Grail into my bedroom, I said. I know Phaedrus is in the kitchen. Camus is running the heated floors because apparently the Vorathi's scales respond well to warmth, and Kierkegaard suggested it, and I found that small comfort gestures cost very little and pay disproportionate dividends. I paused. He's also eating my synthetic protein reserves. We'll deal with that separately. Commander Vothek stared at me. He didn't hurt you, she said. Not a question, an accusation. Of course not, I said. Why would he? He's a shadow predator, a Grell class. He's a confused individual who was raised in an institutional system designed to exploit his instincts and never gave him the vocabulary to process what was being done to him. I've met the type before. It was called my marriage. I folded my arms. The assessment was wrong. Humans are not, as a species, uniquely fragile. We've simply normalized expressing fear. There's a difference. There was a pause. It was a very full pause. What? Said Commander Vothek. Do you want? I want your dominion to leave. I want the Vorathi Grail's designation officially transferred to civilian oversight. Barths will provide the paperwork. And yes, he is authorized, or at least he believes he is, and the distinction is increasingly academic. And I want the formal record to show that this vulnerability assessment was conducted, found inapplicable, and is not to be repeated. Vothek looked at Phaedrus, who had appeared silently in the corridor behind me. He was, I should note, wearing the apron. I had not given him the apron. I believe Kierkegaard had displayed it on the kitchen hook in a deliberate arrangement that he later described as ambient hospitality signaling. Either way, Phaedrus had put it on, and the effect was deeply, structurally confusing to everyone in the corridor. "The Dominion does not respond to civilian demands," Vothek said. "The Dominion," Barth said, rolling forward on his wheelbase with the energy of a very small train reaching a very important station, "is currently in violation of Sections 44, 91, 112, 178, and 203 of the Galactic Property Rights Accord, Article 7 of the Sentient Species Welfare Convention, and 3 separate noise ordinances for the Driftpoint 7 sector, which I admit is a stretch, but I feel confident." He extended a printed document from his chest compartment. "I am also prepared to file a class action on behalf of all Varathi Grell currently held under Dominion classification, which is a much larger case and one I have been building since I processed the xenolinguistics database 2 hours ago. The filing fee is nominal. The embarrassment to the Dominion is estimated at significant." Commander Vothek took the document. She read it. She read 3 pages of it with the expression of someone watching a wall fall down in slow motion. "You cannot sue an imperial power," she said. "I have drafted the complaint," Bartha replied. "Whether the suit succeeds is a philosophical question. Whether the filing becomes public record is not." The Skethric Syndicate came back on a Friday. Of course they did. I want to say I was surprised, but I had, at various points in the preceding weeks, asked Kierkegaard to calculate the probability of the Skethric attempting to retake Calloway's Folly, and he had offered me a number that he prefaced with epistemically, "This is more of a certainty than a probability." They had invested heavily in the heated floors, they had feelings about the hydroponic atrium, and they had apparently decided that the departing Imperial squad, which they had been watching from a distance, represented an opportunity to retake the ship in the resulting confusion. There were 12 of them. They docked at the rear cargo bay, which was, and I say this as a fact and not a complaint, extremely large and echoey, and had the acoustics of a cathedral if the cathedral were made of industrial-grade alloy. Phaedrus heard them before the sensors did. I was in the kitchen with my coffee when his markings went from the calm amber gold he'd developed in the past 2 weeks. Kierkegaard had mapped his color states with the thoroughness of someone who had nothing but time and processing capacity, to a deep, urgent violet red that translated in the glossary we'd built together as threat incoming, multiple signatures. "I am going to handle this." "Phaedrus," I said. He looked at me, his head tilted. "You don't have to handle anything," I said. "You're not a weapon." He made a sound. Kierkegaard translated it in 2 parts. The first part was something like, "I know, but I choose to." The second part was harder to translate, but Kierkegaard's best approximation was, "There is a difference between what I was made to do and what I decide to do. I've been thinking about this for 11 days. I looked at him for a moment, in his apron, holding a spatula he'd been using to redistribute protein compound across the heating surface because he had, in some essential way, decided that learning to cook was worth his time. His cyan markings pulsed quietly. "Fine," I said, "but Barthas goes first, that's the protocol." "Protocol confirmed," Barth said from somewhere near the cargo bay corridor. "I have been preparing for exactly this situation. What followed is a matter of record, and I will summarize it because the full audio transcript runs to 400 pages, and I understand the Bureau has other cases." Barths met the Skethric at the cargo bay entrance. He had printed 40 pages of documentation in advance. He informed them that they were trespassing, that the vessel had been legally transferred, that their prior occupancy created no standing claim under any recognized galactic framework, and that their failure to vacate within the next 30 seconds would constitute contempt of an existing arbitration order, which was slightly fictitious, but delivered with such conviction that 2 of the 12 Skethric actually stepped backward. Phaedrus appeared from the shadows at the 30-second mark. The Skethric Syndicate had worked with shadow predators before. They knew what the Varathi looked like in full threat display. The expanded dorsal frills, the full-spectrum luminescence cycling through crisis colors, the sub-vocalizations that operated below conscious hearing and triggered fear responses directly in the amygdala. What they were not prepared for was a shadow predator in a kitchen apron, holding a spatula standing next to a droid who was still reading from a legal document. The cognitive dissonance was, by all accounts, significant. The lead Skethric, a large one, greenish with the particular air of someone who had intimidated his way through most of his problems, pointed at Phaedrus and said something in Skethric that Kierkegaard translated as, "What is wrong with it?" Phaedrus set the spatula down, carefully. He tilted his head at the exact angle that, in Vorathi body language, Kierkegaard had mapped, as I find your question philosophically interesting, but the conclusion it leads to is inconvenient for you. Then he stepped forward once, slowly. The Skethric moved first. Not all 12. 5 of them broke immediately, which I thought was actually a reasonable tactical assessment given the available information. The other 7 held because they were professionals, or at least they were trying to be. I am not going to detail the next 4 minutes, because the Bureau already has the camera footage, and I do not want to editorialize. I will say, Phaedrus did not kill anyone. He was precise, methodical, and apparently exercising a degree of deliberate restraint that Kierkegaard later told me was not instinctive. It was chosen. Every incapacitated Skethric was left in a position Kierkegaard assessed as uncomfortable but recoverable. One of them was zip-tied to a support column by Barth, who had pivoted from legal filings to physical restraint with the same absolute conviction, and cited his authority under Section 77 of the Galactic Citizens Arrest Protocol. The remaining 7 were in the atrium when I arrived. Phaedrus stood between them and me like a wall that had decided to have opinions. "Here's where we are," I said to the Skethric. "The ship is mine. I have paperwork. You've met Barth, so you know he has more paperwork. You also know that Phaedrus is in a particularly decisive mood today, and I would like, before any further decisions are made, to ask you a question." The lead Skethric looked at me. He was very still. "Was it worth it?" I said. "The original deal with Calloway, whatever he offered you for the ship, was it worth what you spent to get here today?" He didn't answer, but his eyes moved, a brief involuntary calculation. The answer was no. It was always no by the time people were calculating it. "I didn't think so," I said. "Barth." "Already prepared," Barth said. He produced a document with the energy of a man serving an ace. "Settlement agreement. You relinquish all claim to Calloway's Folly, existing fixtures, and the hydroponic atrium. Yes, including the good tomatoes. Don't look at me like that. In exchange for a waiver of all criminal referrals for tonight's events, and a finder's fee of 3,000 solar credits for your contribution to the original interior design, which I will admit was excellent work and should not go unacknowledged." The lead Skethric looked at the document. He looked at Phaedrus. He looked at Bartha. 3,000, he said. "The heated floors alone are worth 5, I said. "I'm being generous." He took the document. He signed it. His people helped the 7 incapacitated ones to their feet, carefully, because Barth was watching and had preemptively cited the relevant handling protocols, and they left. The atrium was quiet. Camus adjusted the temperature. The tomatoes in the hydroponic section rustled slightly in the circulation fans. Phaedrus retrieved his spatula from where he'd set it on the floor. He looked at me. His markings were amber gold. "Good work," I told him. He made a sound that Kierkegaard didn't translate immediately. When I asked, Kierkegaard said, "The closest standard equivalent is something like, 'I am learning what it means to choose when to be what I am.'" I drank my coffee. It was still bitter. I had somewhere between the Imperial Squad and the Skethric negotiation, and 11 days of building a translation glossary with a navigation AI and a creature who was learning to cook, stopped noticing. The Hethari Dominion's response to Barth's filing came 6 weeks later. It was not, to anyone's surprise, an apology. It was a counter-filing that challenged Barth's legal standing, the validity of the Vorathi Grell transfer document, and the application of the Sentient Species Welfare Convention to operational biological assets. It was 30 pages of bureaucratic architecture designed to accomplish nothing except generating enough friction to make the original complaint disappear. Bartha read it in 45 seconds. "This is," he said, "the most sophisticated bad-faith legal filing I have encountered in my career." "Your career started about 2 months ago," I said. "I age in case complexity." He filed a response before I finished my coffee. The response was 60 pages. I did not read all of it, but Kierkegaard summarized it for me. Bartha had essentially turned the counter-filing inside out and used its own arguments to escalate the case from a property dispute to a formal challenge of the Vorathi Grell's legal classification as non-sentient under Dominion law. which, if successful, would void the biological asset designation entirely, not just for Phaedrus but for every Varathi Grell in Dominion custody. That's a very large case, I said. It is a very correct case, Barthis said. I have reviewed the Varathi linguistic complexity assessments that Kierkegaard has compiled. Sentience thresholds are met by a factor of 3. The classification is fraudulent. Phaedrus, who was in the kitchen making breakfast, he had by that point independently figured out how to calibrate Sartre's synthesis protocols for his dietary needs, which were interesting and involved a lot of fermented grain compound that smelled aggressively of something I chose not to identify, came to the kitchen doorway. His markings pulsed in the slow, questioning amber of what Kierkegaard had mapped as what is happening. So I told him as accurately as I could, through the translation glossary and Kierkegaard's assistance. He was still for a long moment. His markings cycled through several states we'd catalogued and one we hadn't. Kierkegaard said, "I cannot translate this precisely. The closest I can approximate is, he is experiencing something between fear and hope simultaneously, and does not know which one to trust." "Neither do I, usually," I said, "but Barth filed it anyway. That's the thing about him. He doesn't wait for certainty, he just files." The case took 14 months. I will not pretend it was clean or fast, or that the Dominion didn't deploy every bureaucratic weapon in their considerable arsenal. They did. Barthis met all of them. Sometimes I thought he was enjoying it, in the specific way of a system that had finally found work, proportionate to its capacity. During those 14 months, Callaway's Folly moved through 3 sectors, took on 2 short-term freight contracts that Kierkegaard negotiated with what I can only describe as aggressive competence, and developed over time the texture of a place that had been lived in rather than merely occupied. Phaedrus learned to cook 7 dishes. Not well at first. There was an incident involving the protein synthesizer and a miscalibrated heat setting that Camus is still processing. But persistently. He was, I discovered, an extremely persistent learner. It was the one thing his military conditioning had given him that was actually useful, the capacity to repeat an action until it became understanding. He also began to attend what I had started calling, only to myself, the nightly sessions. Not therapy, precisely, not conversation exactly, more like 2 creatures in a room at the end of the day, communicating what they could within the limits of a translation system that was still being built, and sitting with the parts that couldn't be communicated yet without it being intolerable. I told him about the divorce once. Not as a story, I don't do stories, but as a fact. The way my ex-husband had signed the transfer documents without looking up, the particular quality of the silence in the legal office afterward, the way I had walked out and kept walking because stopping felt dangerous. His markings were very quiet while I spoke. Then they did the slow rolling pulse, the one he'd done in my bedroom on the first night, when I'd offered him a name. Kierkegaard translated it this time, because our glossary was better now. "I understand what it is to be transferred without being seen." "I know you do," I said. We sat with that for a while. The corridor light was on, no ghosts tripped. The ruling came on a Tuesday. I know because Barthes announced it at 3:47 ship time by rolling into the kitchen and saying, "I have won to Sartre," who could not process legal outcomes, but acknowledged the statement politely. By the time I arrived, bleary and slightly irritated, Barthes had already printed the ruling summary and the official Galactic Arbitration Bureau certificate and had begun drafting a press release, which no one had asked him to do, but which he had decided was appropriate. The ruling. The Varathi Grail Sentient Species Classification Challenge was upheld pending review of the full Dominion case. The biological asset designation was suspended pending that review. All Varathi Grail under active Dominion deployment orders were placed in a protected status, which meant they could not legally be redeployed during the review period. The review was projected to take 3 years. 3 years during which approximately 40 Varathi Grell would not be dropped into bedrooms. Not justice, not yet, but a door opened a crack by a droid with a corrupted subroutine and absolute conviction. Phaedrus read the summary over my shoulder. I don't know how much he understood from the text. We were still working on standard literacy, which was a project, but Kierkegaard translated the key points, and I watched his markings move through a sequence I had never seen before and have not seen since. There is no entry for it in the glossary. Kierkegaard said, "I do not have an accurate translation. I think it may not have a standard equivalent. It may be something that only exists in Varati." "That's fine," I said. I smoothed the counter once, habit, and poured 2 coffees. One for me, bitter as always. One synthetic warm compound for Phaedrus, calibrated to his chemistry, which Sartre had figured out around week 3 and saved as a preset. We sat at the kitchen table, while Callaway's Folly drifted through the dark at Drift Point 7, stationery, which Kierkegaard had told me once was a choice with emotional implications. He wasn't wrong. This concludes my testimony. I want to be precise about one final thing for the record. I did not set out to build a household. I set out to be alone in a ship I owned, drinking bad coffee and paying alimony to no one, and finally, occupying a place in physical space without apologizing for it. What I have instead is one navigation AI who waits 3 hours before bringing up the things I don't want to talk about, which is better than most people's timing. One maintenance droid who genuinely believes he won the Galactic Citation for Legal Excellence in 2398, which he absolutely did not, but which I have chosen not to correct because his belief in it makes him file harder. One shadow predator who has learned to cook 7 dishes, chosen his own name, and is currently working through a glossary of standard that he treats with the same methodical persistence he once applied to hunting. They are, if I am being precise, the first household I have lived in where no one expects me to be smaller than I am. I did not choose this. The universe arranged it at me, one improbable domino at a time, beginning with an ex-husband who couldn't look up from a contract. I chose to stay. That's different. That's enough. For the Bureau's reference, the fork is still under the pillow. Barth says it's a fire code violation. I told him to file a complaint. He did. Casilda Maldana. Aboard Callaway's Folly, Drift Point 7. Submitted with extreme reluctance and exactly 1